Have you ever watched someone master the art of emotional distance with such precision that they become trapped in their own fortress? When avoidant strength becomes their greatest weakness, something fascinating happens in human psychology. The very traits that once protected someone transform into the barriers that isolate them from everything they secretly long for. Picture this scenario that plays out countless times across relationships everywhere. Someone develops incredible self-reliance, emotional regulation, and independence. These become their superpowers, their shield against a world that once felt unpredictable or overwhelming. Yet somewhere along the way, these strengths begin working against them. The fortress meant to protect becomes the prison that confines. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's subtle, like watching Blair Waldorf from Gossip Girl slowly realize that her perfectly crafted exterior might be keeping people from seeing who she really is underneath. The avoidant person starts as someone who simply learned to cope brilliantly with emotional chaos. They developed strategies that worked beautifully in childhood or during difficult periods. Independence became their language, self-sufficiency became their religion. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Those same coping mechanisms that once served them so well begin to create the very problems they were designed to prevent. The person who never needed anyone suddenly finds themselves profoundly alone. The individual who prided themselves on emotional stability discovers they've become emotionally unavailable, not just to others, but to themselves. What makes this particularly tragic is how invisible the process becomes. Unlike other attachment styles where the struggles are more obvious, avoidant individuals often appear to be thriving on the surface. They're successful, composed, seemingly content with their independence. But beneath that polished exterior, something crucial is missing. The connections that give life its deepest meaning remain frustratingly out of reach. The cognitive biases at play here make the situation even more complex. Confirmation bias kicks in hard, causing avoidant individuals to notice evidence that supports their belief that relationships are unreliable while overlooking moments of genuine connection. They might dismiss a partner's loving gesture as temporary or question its authenticity, unconsciously searching for proof that their emotional walls are justified. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy that would make even the most skilled psychologist pause in recognition. By expecting relationships to disappoint, avoidant individuals unconsciously behave in ways that increase the likelihood of that disappointment. They pull back when someone gets close. They interpret normal relationship challenges as evidence that emotional investment was a mistake. They protect themselves so thoroughly that they inadvertently push away the very connections they're protecting themselves from losing. Understanding this pattern matters more than most people realize. Whether you recognize these tendencies in yourself or someone you care about, recognizing when strength becomes limitation can be the first step toward transformation. The avoidant person isn't broken or defective. They're simply operating from outdated software that once served a crucial purpose, but now needs updating. The journey from recognizing this pattern to changing it requires both compassion and courage. It means acknowledging that the very traits you've relied upon might need to be balanced with their opposites. Independence needs to make room for interdependence. Emotional regulation needs to allow space for vulnerability. Self-reliance needs to coexist with the willingness to let others matter. If you want to better understand someone's attachment style, see the link in the description to one of the most popular books on attachment theory. Now, let's explore how this plays out in real life through a story that illustrates just how complex this transformation can become. Imagine someone named Marcus, a successful architect who had built his entire life around the principle of emotional self-sufficiency. His childhood had been marked by parents who were well-meaning but emotionally inconsistent. One day they'd be warm and available, the next day stressed and distant. Young Marcus learned that the safest approach was to need nothing from anyone. This strategy worked brilliantly for decades. Marcus excelled in school because he never relied on others for motivation or support. He built a thriving business because he could make decisions without getting bogged down in emotional considerations. His friends respected his calm demeanor and sought his advice because he seemed so rational and unflappable. But here's where the story takes a turn that even Marcus didn't see coming. At 35, Marcus met someone who challenged everything he thought he knew about relationships. Sarah was warm, emotionally expressive, and genuinely interested in connecting with him on a deeper level. For the first few months, Marcus was intrigued. Here was someone who seemed different from the emotionally chaotic people he'd learned to avoid. Sarah was stable but emotionally available, consistent but not distant. But as their relationship deepened, something unexpected happened. The closer Sarah tried to get, the more uncomfortable Marcus became. Not because Sarah was doing anything wrong, but because her genuine affection activated every alarm system Marcus had spent years perfecting. When Sarah would share vulnerable moments from her day, Marcus would find himself analyzing her words rather than feeling them. When she expressed love, part of his mind immediately began questioning her motives or wondering when the other shoe would drop. The confirmation bias became Marcus's invisible enemy. He started noticing every time Sarah seemed slightly less enthusiastic about their plans, interpreting these normal fluctuations as evidence that his emotional walls were justified. When Sarah had a stressful week at work and was less available, instead of offering support, Marcus felt relief. Here was proof that people eventually become inconsistent and unreliable. What Marcus couldn't see was how his own behavior was contributing to the very dynamic he feared. When Sarah reached for emotional connection, Marcus would subtly redirect conversations toward practical matters. When she tried to include him in her world of friends and family, he'd find reasons to maintain some distance, not because he didn't care about Sarah, but because caring felt dangerous in ways he couldn't articulate. The tragedy was that Marcus genuinely wanted the relationship to work, but his protective strategies were sabotaging his chances at the connection he secretly craved. Sarah began feeling like she was dating someone who was physically present but emotionally just out of reach. She'd catch glimpses of the warm, connected person Marcus could be, but those moments felt fleeting and unpredictable. 6 months into their relationship, Sarah did something that changed everything. Instead of pulling away or demanding more emotional availability, she sat Marcus down and said something that cut through all his defenses. She told him she could see how much he cared and how hard he was working to protect himself from being hurt. She wasn't asking him to change overnight, but she wanted him to know that his emotional safety mattered to her too. This moment created a crisis point for Marcus. His avoidance strategies suddenly felt transparent and inadequate. Sarah's response didn't fit the pattern he expected. She wasn't becoming emotionally chaotic or threatening to leave unless he changed immediately. Instead, she was offering something he'd never experienced before. Acceptance of his protective strategies combined with an invitation to experiment with something different. What happened next reveals something crucial about how avoidant strengths can be transformed rather than abandoned. Marcus realized that his emotional regulation and independence weren't things he needed to give up, but rather tools he could use more consciously. Instead of automatically distancing himself when he felt overwhelmed by closeness, he could communicate that need for space while reassuring Sarah of his commitment to working through the discomfort. But the transformation wasn't immediate or simple. Marcus discovered that his biggest challenge wasn't learning new relationship skills, but rather unlearning the assumption that emotional needs were inherently dangerous. Every time he took a small risk by being vulnerable or asking for support, part of his mind waited for the relationship to become chaotic or unpredictable. When that didn't happen, he had to consciously update his internal database about what relationships could be. The story reaches its resolution in an unexpected way. Marcus and Sarah's relationship didn't become perfectly smooth, but it became real in a way that honored both of their needs. Marcus learned to communicate his need for independence as a strength he brought to the relationship, rather than a wall he used to keep Sarah out. Sarah learned to appreciate the stability and thoughtfulness that Marcus's avoidant traits could offer when they weren't being used defensively. Years later, Marcus would look back on this period as the time when his greatest strength almost became his greatest limitation, and how recognizing that pattern opened up possibilities he never knew existed. But the transformation required him to move beyond the cognitive biases that kept him trapped in outdated patterns of thinking and relating. Now, let's talk about what this means for you practically. If you recognize avoidant patterns in yourself, the first step isn't to abandon your strengths, but to understand how they might be working overtime in ways that no longer serve you. Your emotional regulation is genuinely valuable, but notice when it crosses the line into emotional disconnection. Your independence is an asset, but observe whether it's preventing you from experiencing the interdependence that makes relationships fulfilling. Start by paying attention to your internal dialogue during moments of potential emotional connection. When someone expresses care or affection, what thoughts immediately arise? Do you find yourself analyzing their motives, questioning the sustainability of their feelings, or looking for evidence that this positive moment won't last? These aren't signs that you're broken, but rather signals that your protective systems are working harder than necessary. The confirmation bias will be your biggest obstacle here. Your mind has become skilled at noticing information that confirms your beliefs about the unreliability of emotional connections while filtering out evidence to the contrary. Combat this by consciously looking for examples of emotional consistency in your relationships. When someone shows up for you repeatedly, when they remain steady during conflict, when they demonstrate care through actions over time, let this information update your internal database about what's possible. Practice what could be called graduated emotional risk-taking. Instead of diving into vulnerability all at once, which would feel overwhelming and activate all your protective systems, experiment with small acts of emotional openness. Share one thing you're genuinely excited about. Ask for support with something minor. Express appreciation in a way that feels slightly more vulnerable than your usual approach. Notice what happens when you take these small risks. The key insight here is that your avoidant strengths don't need to disappear. They need to become more flexible. Think of Joe Goldberg from the Netflix series You as an extreme example of what happens when protective strategies become rigid and all-consuming. While Joe's behavior is obviously pathological, the underlying pattern of using control and distance as protection is something many avoidant individuals can relate to in much healthier forms. Your emotional regulation can become a gift you offer to relationships rather than a wall you use to manage them. When conflicts arise, instead of shutting down emotionally, you can use your natural calm to create space for productive conversation. When your partner is struggling with their own emotions, your stability can be an anchor rather than a judgment about their emotional expression. Communication becomes crucial in this transformation. Instead of simply pulling back when you feel overwhelmed by closeness, practice articulating what you're experiencing. You might say something like, "The closeness we've been sharing feels really good and also a little overwhelming for me. Can we take things at a pace that lets me stay present rather than shutting down?" This honors both your need for emotional regulation and your commitment to the relationship. Learn to distinguish between alone time that rejuvenates you and isolation that protects you from risk. Healthy independence involves choosing solitude because it genuinely serves your well-being and makes you more available for connection. Protective isolation involves avoiding connection because emotional risk feels too dangerous. The difference lies in whether your alone time increases or decreases your capacity for relationship. Challenge yourself to stay curious about other people's emotional experiences rather than immediately categorizing them as chaotic or unpredictable. When someone expresses strong feelings, instead of internally distancing yourself, try asking questions that help you understand their inner world. This doesn't mean you have to match their emotional intensity, but it does mean staying emotionally present rather than retreating into analysis mode. The cognitive bias known as the fundamental attribution error often plays a role in avoidant patterns. This bias causes people to attribute others' behavior to character flaws while attributing their own behavior to circumstances. When someone becomes emotional during conflict, the avoidant person might think they're just an emotional person, rather than considering the specific circumstances that prompted the emotional response. Recognizing this bias can help you stay more curious and less judgmental about others' emotional expressions. Practice receiving care and affection without immediately looking for the catch or the inevitable disappointment. This requires consciously overriding years of protective programming that taught you to be suspicious of good things. When someone does something kind, instead of analyzing their motives, experiment with simply receiving the gesture and expressing genuine appreciation. Remember that interdependence isn't the same as dependence. Many avoidant individuals fear that letting others matter will make them weak or needy. In reality, healthy interdependence involves two independent people choosing to enhance each other's lives. You maintain your individual identity and capabilities while also allowing space for mutual support and connection. The transformation also requires updating your definition of strength. Avoidant individuals often equate emotional invulnerability with strength, but true strength involves the capacity to remain open and present even when emotions feel intense or unpredictable. Think of Emily Cooper from Emily in Paris. While her character can be frustrating in her emotional directness, she demonstrates the kind of emotional courage that allows her to remain open to connection despite repeated disappointments. Work on expanding your emotional vocabulary and awareness. Avoidant individuals often experience emotions but struggle to identify or articulate them clearly. This emotional suppression isn't intentional, it's simply an underdeveloped skill. Start noticing physical sensations that accompany different emotional states. Practice naming emotions as they arise, even if you don't plan to express them immediately. The goal isn't to become an emotionally expressive person if that doesn't align with your natural temperament. The goal is to ensure that your emotional regulation serves connection rather than preventing it. You can remain calm and thoughtful while also being emotionally available and responsive to the people who matter to you. Finally, recognize that this transformation is a gradual process that requires patience with yourself. The patterns you developed served important purposes, and changing them means risking the very things those patterns were designed to protect you from. But the potential rewards, deeper connections, more fulfilling relationships, and the experience of being truly known and appreciated make the risk worthwhile. As we reach the end of this exploration, it's important to recognize that the journey from avoidant strength to avoidant limitation and back to transformed strength isn't a linear process. It's more like learning to dance with parts of yourself that have been at war for years. The protective systems that once served you so well don't need to be your enemies, but they can't remain your only strategy for navigating intimate relationships. The most powerful realization for many avoidant individuals is that their fear of emotional chaos or inconsistency often becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. By protecting themselves so thoroughly from potential disappointment, they create the very disconnection they're trying to avoid. But when those same protective instincts are channeled consciously rather than automatically, they become genuine assets in building stable, lasting connections. Think about Marcus from our earlier story. His transformation didn't require him to become a different person or abandon the traits that made him successful and respected. Instead, he learned to use his natural stability and thoughtfulness as bridges toward connection rather than walls against it. His emotional regulation became a gift he offered to his relationship with Sarah rather than a shield he used to keep her at arm's length. The cognitive biases we've discussed, confirmation bias, fundamental attribution error, and the tendency towards self-fulfilling prophecies, aren't character flaws but rather predictable patterns of human thinking that can be recognized and adjusted. When you notice yourself looking for evidence that emotional connections are unreliable, you can consciously balance that search with attention to moments of consistency and care that your protective systems might otherwise filter out. The call to action here isn't about dramatic personality changes or forcing yourself into uncomfortable emotional territory. It's about conscious choice and gradual expansion. Start by noticing one area where your avoidant strengths might be working overtime. Maybe it's the tendency to analyze rather than feel during intimate conversations. Maybe it's the habit of maintaining emotional distance even when someone has proven their consistency over time. Choose one small experiment in staying present rather than retreating into protective mode. When someone expresses care, try receiving it for 30 seconds before your analytical mind kicks in. When conflict arises, experiment with staying emotionally available for 1 extra minute before shutting down. These tiny shifts in timing can create space for experiences that update your internal programming about what relationships can offer. Remember that vulnerability isn't about dramatic emotional disclosure or losing your sense of personal boundaries. True vulnerability for avoidant individuals often looks like staying present during moments when every instinct says to emotionally retreat. It's about letting someone see that their feelings matter to you, even when that caring feels slightly dangerous. The transformation from avoidant strength to avoidant limitation and ultimately to integrated strength is one of the most hopeful journeys in human psychology. It demonstrates that the very traits that can isolate us also contain the seeds of deep connection when approached with consciousness and courage. Your capacity for emotional regulation can become the steady presence that allows others to feel safe being vulnerable with you. Your independence can model healthy autonomy while still leaving room for interdependence. The question isn't whether you should change who you are, but whether you're ready to use who you are in service of the connections that make life meaningful. The fortress you built was necessary once, but it doesn't have to be a prison forever. The same architectural skills that built those walls can be used to construct bridges, creating passages between your inner world and the people who matter most. When avoidant strength becomes integrated rather than defensive, it creates some of the most stable and nurturing relationships imaginable. The person who once feared emotional chaos becomes someone who can hold space for the full range of human experience without losing their center. The individual who once avoided dependence discovers the profound satisfaction of chosen interdependence with people who have proven worthy of trust. Your journey toward this integration starts with a single recognition. The protective strategies that once served you can evolve to serve not just your safety, but your deepest longings for authentic connection. The strength is already there. Now it's time to let it serve love as skillfully as it once served survival.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.